If you could wave a wand and everyone who viewed your channel would walk away with like one concept or idea that you think is really important, what would you want to be communicated to people?
Probably never to essentialize. That's the main problem that I run up against. And this is there's something you taught in sociology, at least I was in university, called the sociological imagination. The basic idea is that nothing is ever the way it is simply because it is the way it is. Every society around the world, the reason their culture is what it is, the reason they speak what they speak, their food, everything about them, everything about what we are and what we do, why the Nazis believed what the Nazis did, what we believe what we do. Nothing just is. There are always reasons. It always goes back. There's an infinite, like, recursive, analysis you can do going back to the beginning of time. You choose a point to start and you move from there. And if people forget that, you fall into these problems where people develop really essentialist perspectives on sociological problems. Well, why are white people like this? Well, they just are, Or why are black people like this? Well, they just are. Men and women and so on. If people could not do that, I think that you would essentially upend reactionary politics overnight.
Would you say then that that's like one of your personal like ethics? Do you have like a set of like kind of concretized personal ethics that you try to follow? Because this sounds like a really good ethic, not just a good kind of like way to think about things.
Yeah, well, I guess no simple answers would be like a good general motif there. If there were any simple answers to social problems, then there wouldn't be there wouldn't be a need for any of this, of course. And that's not to say sometimes the solutions aren't simple, A simple solution can be backed by a really complicated answer. Rather just to say like there will always be people who are trying to sell you on the idea that everything is the way it is for very simple reasons and like just adopt this worldview and like everything falls into place. And I just don't think that's fair or valid. I see leftists try to do that as well, and I think often they do so while misinterpreting leftist theory. So I just don't. It's just not a good road to go down. It always leads to bad analysis.
It makes me think of I'm sure like in science you often learn like keep it simple, stupid, or Occam's razor. Do you think that Occam's obviously I would argue most people don't understand what Occam's razor actually is. They tend to conflate Occam's razor with keep it simple, stupid. Would you basically fully disagree with the concept of let's start with first keep it simple, stupid?
Yeah, well, in the understanding you have of the issue, I think that it should be kept simple, especially when it comes to communicating that. Oftentimes, this stuff isn't as complicated as people like to make it out to be. Or to put it another way, you could have like a PhD level background in Marxian theory, and that could inform an analysis of a subject. But you could probably also get a pretty concrete understanding of that issue based on a high school education, or even less. You can appeal to simpler values. It's what would you say? It's like it's a fractal. There's an infinite level of complexity. You can always go one layer deeper. It's like trying to find the length of America's border coast, across the West Coast. Well, it's like 3,000 miles from a satellite, but if you get up and look at every individual grain of sand and count along that border, you'd have millions of miles of border. So it's a meaningless question.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with using the satellite answer as long as you acknowledge that's what you're doing and don't pretend there aren't other ways of doing it.
Okay, interesting. Do you think it's really important though to communicate? Because you kind of said like you can analyze things from a really complex lens, but you want to communicate in a more simple way. Do you think it's really important to communicate to like audiences more simple answers, or do you think it's important to communicate both? Like how do you find the balance between that?
I think it's possible to communicate really complicated ideas in simple language most of the time. One of the nice things about sociology is that you don't need technical definitions very often when you're reducing a subject down to its simplest point. When you're talking about something in the fields of like agriculture or engineering or physics, sometimes you have
Mhm.
these irreducible points where it's like, okay, you need to know what this term means or you can't move forward. Most
Mhm.
sociological terms are intuitive to us because we live in a society. So we know a lot of the basic building blocks around us, even if we're not that well educated in how they work. And because of that, we have to take advantage of this, right? We have to, if there is a medium through which you can get these answers across easily, I think you should try to as best as you can. But you should always kind of remind people like there's always a greater degree of complexity. Like there's always more to it. It's like that, all I know is that I know nothing thing, where people get educated in a field, and when they get their PhD, they're like, "Well, I don't know anything about any of this. I'm a
Mhm.
fucking idiot." That's a good attitude to have. I think we should all have that on many issues.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one of the, like the core values that I try to encourage in my viewers in my much smaller access to people, but also fundamentally for myself is to maintain some level of epistemic humility of like realizing that while there's like, a small circle of things that I do know, and there's a much bigger circle of things that the entire human race knows, there's an even bigger circle of things that we don't know, and we don't know that we don't know it. Which I think is really important, especially like in the sciences and in thought to be reminded of, which makes me think of that. So sociology. So did you do your undergrad? I don't know your education background fully.
Just an undergrad. And yes, in sociology with a minor in communications.
Okay, interesting. What made you decide to go into sociology?
Well, I originally favored the hard sciences because I'm autistic. But when I was in 12th grade, I had an advanced history professor,
Mhm.
Professor Hinojosa. Or I guess it would have been Mr. Hinojosa because it was high school. I don't know. Anyway, great guy, very hot, and great educator. Class was on comparative political systems. How does Iran's government work compared to Russia, Brazil, America, the UK, and a couple others? Learn a
Interesting.
lot just, comparing stuff like that. Oh, well, why do we do it this way as opposed to this? And then you go back to the 14th century or something. Got me into social sciences. When I went to community college afterwards, I tried out political science, but I really didn't like how for lack of a better term, like amoral political sciences. Political science felt like it was all about explaining why things are the way they are, but there wasn't much of an activist element to it. Like if you go into a sociology 101 class and you're learning about like the history of white supremacy in the United States, the teacher is not just going to tell you about it. Like they're telling a good versus evil narrative, which I like.
Mhm.
I'm okay with moralizing issues, in an educational sense. But if you're talking like in poli sci, like the classes that I took, it was like, well, these countries are democracies because they have the, political capital and these economic forces and blah, blah. And these countries are authoritarian. And like, that's just how it is. It was very matter of fact. And I didn't like that. It felt like that analysis didn't leave much room for making the world better. So I tried sociology and I loved that.
Okay, so you like specifically kind of the political moralized element that's included within the sociological analysis of the world.
Yes, overwhelmingly. Not all professors are going to be like that, but the field as a whole is definitely tilted in that direction.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've talked to a lot of sociology professors and majors and stuff like that, and I feel like a lot of times they kind of deny that that's the case. Whereas, like, as somebody who's psych is obviously we do our best to be like as amoral as possible all the time. We're highly, highly clinical and very individual in our analysis. And it's interesting. I'd be curious if maybe is that generally in sociology acknowledged that like, yeah, we're highly moralized and
I,
political
I
in
think
our
it's
analysis.
it's generally understood that the purpose of understanding something is so that you can change that thing, at least in the field of sociology. I think that there
Hmm.
would be a political bias to psychiatry because your bias is towards psychiatric normalcy. The idea that there are like operating limits of the human brain, and if they go outside of that, then it's like you have like schizophrenics or people are unhealthy or self-destructive. So the bias would be towards self-care there, like a healthy life. And I think the same can be applied to sociology. Obviously, it's a bit more scaled up. What does a healthy society look like? Find 50 people, they'll give you 51 answers. But there are some general commonalities, right? Oh, the world that we live in is unfortunately not exactly bereft of like easy, evil, good examples. Genocides happen all the time. Like millions will die and the news will barely cover it sometimes. In a world like this, I think there are definitely examples you can point to and go like, what socioeconomic factors led to like the Rwanda genocide and how do we keep that from happening again? And I think it's fine to approach things that way because otherwise, if you could imagine a class where somebody was going over what led to the Holocaust and there was no moralizing there, it was just, well, when societies have, political tensions that they need to resolve by scapegoating an ethnic group, it would come across a bit strange because culturally we're used to associating the Nazis with the bad guys. And I think that's good.
Mhm.
We should always remember that there's a reason why we're learning all this crap.
So you got into sociology because you like the moralized piece. What got you interested in this stuff? Because like it's not the average child that gets born into the world and is like, man, I just want to like, fight for political moral movements, That's a very unique thing. So what triggered you into that?
Well, I like arguments. That I've always liked. I've always liked speaking publicly. I've always liked arguments. That's been a since I was 5 years old thing. That goes back a long while. And I like systemic analysis. I like systemic analysis of any kind, really, whether it's sociological or physical. You know, like you give me like a bridge or something and you have all the arrows and how the forces settle and everything. I think that's very interesting. I think it's cool to break things down to their constituent parts. But if you want to really argue with people over something, you know, the real dicey topics are in sociology. I know them engineers, you know, will bludgeon each other with their protractors while arguing over like the most efficient, you know, way to distribute a load or whatever. But folks love arguing politics, and I like arguing politics. And if you add that to the systemic analysis factor, I think it all just gets so much more interesting. Psychology itself, of course, is a massively reliant on systemic analysis because that's the process by which you break down, you know, the characteristics you consider to be, you know, like beneficial to oneself and elsewise, like what leads to what. I think it's just kind of the root of education, frankly, breaking something down to its constituent parts, seeing how it works, then trying to reassemble it. And, you know, I suppose that people will just fall in, you know, whichever direction they're kind of preordained to based on their pre-existing interests if they get the opportunity to choose between those fields.